I came back to Caerwyn Hall in October, which tells you something about my state of mind. No one returns to Caerwyn Hall in October by choice. The light leaves by 4, the moors turn the color of old pewter, and the hall itself, 46 rooms, 30 of which have not been heated since my mother died, develops a quality of cold that is not merely weather but opinion. Caerwyn Hall in October is a house that is telling you something. I had spent 14 years not listening to it. I came back because of a letter. Not from my father. My father and I had not corresponded in 7 years, and before that only through the estate solicitor, and before that through a mutual silence so total it might as well have been correspondence. The letter was from Mrs. Henwick, my father's housekeeper, who had written to me twice before in 14 years, once when my mother died, and once when my father's knee was operated on and she thought I ought to know, and who wrote in the same plain, affectless style both times. Here is the situation, here is what it requires, here is what I cannot manage alone. The situation this time was this. My great-aunt Dorothea, who was my mother's aunt, not my father's, and who had lived at Caerwyn Hall for the past 4 years in the East Wing on the understanding that she and my father would maintain a polite, minimal arrangement and not speak of things that had happened, was unwell. She had written, apparently, to a distant connection of the family named Miss Isolde Wren, who was a young woman of no particular income and no particular position, and who had accepted an invitation to come to Caerwyn Hall and serve as her companion for however long the situation required. Mrs. Henwick wrote that she had no objection to Miss Wren, who had arrived quietly and made no demands, but that the arrangement seemed likely to be of longer duration than anyone had anticipated, and that she thought, this was the part that had made me put the letter down and pick it up again 3 times. She thought it might be useful for someone in the family to be present. Someone in the family. There was at this point only me. I drove north in 2 days and arrived at Caerwyn Hall on a Tuesday evening in the first week of October, when the light was already failing and the moorland on either side of the track was the color I remembered from childhood dreams, that flat, wind-bent gray, and the hall appeared at the end of the drive exactly as it always had. Enormous, mostly dark, 2 lit windows on the ground floor and 1 on the 3rd. My old window. Someone had left a lamp on in my old room, which I chose not to think about. Mrs. Henwick met me at the door. She was older, 14 years older, which was obvious and also somehow surprising, as though I had expected the hall to be in the condition I had left it, and Mrs. Henwick to be 43 and my father to be 58 and my mother to be alive. None of these things were true. Mr. Callum, she said, which was what she had always called me. Not Lord Callum, which was technically correct, and not Mr. Vane, which would have confused me with my father. Mr. Callum, which was the name of the boy I had been in this house, and which she used now with the same complete absence of sentiment she brought to everything. Mrs. Henwick, I said, how is he? Your father is well, she said. He is in the study. Miss Wren is at dinner with Miss Dorothea. And Miss Dorothea? Not well, she said, but comfortable. Miss Wren manages her very ably. She took my coat. She showed me to the room I had always used when I visited as an adult, which was not my childhood room. That room, I would discover later, was exactly as I had left it at 19. Same books on the shelf, same water glass on the nightstand, same view of the rose garden from the window, the roses now entirely unpruned and enormously overgrown. I did not discover this that night. That night I changed my coat and went down to the study. My father was standing at the window when I came in. He was 71 years old. He was still tall. I had got my height from him and nothing else. We had always agreed on that at least, and his hair was white now, which it had not been when I last saw him, and he held himself with the same quality of absolute composure that I had always found, as a young man, simultaneously admirable and infuriating. The Duke of Caerwyn, the most formal man in 3 counties, which was an achievement in a region where formality was considered a civic virtue. He turned when he heard the door. He said, Callum. I said, "Father." This was, I should note, already an improvement on our last meeting, which had involved fewer words and more volume. We looked at each other across the study, which smelled of old paper and coal smoke, and something else I recognized but could not name, and then he said, "Sit down. I'll have Mrs. Henwick bring something." I sat, he sat. Mrs. Henwick brought whiskey and a plate of things I did not eat. We talked about the drive, which was fine. We talked about the estate accounts, which were in order. We talked about Miss Dorothea's health, which was declining in the expected way. We did not talk about 14 years. This was normal. This was, in fact, the best conversation my father and I had managed in perhaps 20 years. Civil, brief, neither of us pretending it was something it was not. I finished my whiskey and said good night, and he said good night, and I went upstairs and lay on the bed in my adult room and looked at the ceiling and thought, well, here I am. I have come back, and nothing has changed and nothing will, and I will manage Miss Dorothea's situation and the estate accounts and return to London in a fortnight. I met Isolde Wren the following morning. She was in the breakfast room when I came down, reading a letter and eating toast with the efficient, unself-conscious manner of someone who had been doing this for weeks and had no particular thoughts about it. She was 28 years old, though I did not know this yet. She was not beautiful in the usual drawing-room sense. She had a plain, open, very direct face and brown hair and gray eyes, and she was wearing a dark blue day dress that was clean and well-made and several seasons behind the fashion, which I noticed only because she noticed me noticing and did not seem to care at all. "You're Mr. Callum," she said, not a question. "I am," I said, "and you're Miss Wren." "Yes," she went back to the letter. "Miss Dorothea is having a good morning. She'll be down later if you want to see her. Your father had breakfast at 7 and is in the estate office." I said, "You seem very at home here." She looked up. "I have been here 6 weeks, she said. "I know where the breakfast things are." I sat down and poured coffee and looked at her across the table and tried to work out what I was looking at. I had expected, I am not entirely sure what I had expected. Someone more anxious, perhaps. Someone who performed their gratitude for the invitation more visibly, the way people perform gratitude when they are aware of their precarious position. Someone who was careful with me, the way people are careful with the estranged son of a powerful man when the estrangement is known and the outcome uncertain. She was none of these things. She read her letter, a brief one, which she folded and put in her pocket, ate her toast, and when she looked up again, it was with the direct, unassuming attention of someone who was simply present in the room and had no agenda about it. "How long have you been away?" she asked. 14 years. "That's a long time," she said, without judgment. She said it the way you would say the moors are large or the light leaves early, a plain statement of fact. "Yes," I said. "Miss Dorothea told me about your mother," she said. "I'm sorry. She spoke of her very fondly." I said, "Thank you." "Your father keeps her portrait in the morning room," she said. "He turns it toward the window on Sunday mornings. I noticed it the second week." I did not know what to say to this. I had not known he did this, and I did not know how to feel about the fact that this woman, this stranger who had been in my family's house for 6 weeks, knew it and I did not. I said, "How is my father?" She considered the question, not with the performing consideration quality of someone who is being careful with a sensitive topic, but with the actual consideration of someone who is forming an honest answer. "Formal," she said, "very formal. I think he has been formal for a long time and he doesn't quite know how to be anything else with most people." She paused. "He is kind to Miss Dorothea in his way. He brings her books she hasn't asked for, the right books always, which means he is paying attention. He doesn't talk about it." I looked at her. "You have observed a great deal in 6 weeks." "I observe people," she said. "It is something I do. I lost my mother in April and I have had very little else to do since then but observe people and try to understand what they need." She said this without self-pity. It was simply the explanation for a habit, stated plainly. I find your father interesting. Most people find him intimidating, I said. Yes, she said. I can see why, but intimidating and interesting aren't the same thing. She stood, gathered her letter and her cup and said, I'll be with Miss Dorothea this morning if you need anything. And she walked out of the breakfast room with the same complete lack of ceremony with which she had entered it. I sat at the breakfast table for a while after she left and thought about what had just happened, which was nothing, a perfectly unremarkable exchange, and which had nonetheless left me with the distinct impression that I had been looked at very thoroughly and found neither impressive nor unimpressive, simply present, which was an experience I had not had in some time. Over the following days I developed a habit. I am not proud of this as a habit, but I am going to be honest about it, of placing myself in rooms where Isolde Wren was likely to be without appearing to do so. This was partly surveillance and partly something I did not have a name for yet. I observed her with Miss Dorothea, who was confined largely to the east wing now, and who brightened noticeably when Isolde came in, not because Isolde performed brightness, but because she brought it with her in the same way she brought everything, without making a production of it. I observed her with Mrs. Henwick, to whom she spoke as an equal, and with whom she had apparently established, in 6 weeks, a relationship of mutual practical respect that Mrs. Henwick extended to almost no one. I observed her in the morning room and the library and the rose garden, where she had apparently taken to walking each afternoon regardless of the weather, and where she did not attempt to address the roses, which were overgrown beyond any reasonable address, but simply walked among them and looked at them with the same steady, observant attention she gave everything else. And I observed her with my father. This is what I could not stop watching. My father was a man who received people. He received them well, with perfect courtesy, with correct attention, with the gracious, formal warmth of someone who had been managing his own surface for so long that the surface and the man had become difficult to distinguish. He received me this way. He had always received me this way, from the time I was old enough to understand what it meant, and it was this, more than the specific events of 14 years ago, more than the argument and the ultimatum and the long silence. It was this receiving quality that had made me leave and stay away. I was tired of being received by my own father. I wanted to be known. Isolde Wren, I observed, was not received. She simply appeared in rooms, spoke when she had something to say, listened when she didn't, and returned to whatever she had been doing. She made no attempt to manage my father's comfort or perform consideration of his position. She handed him things, a book she had been reading that she thought he might find useful, a cup of tea that had been brought for him and gone cold while he was reviewing accounts, a letter from the estate solicitor that had been mislaid in the morning's post, with the same direct, unassuming efficiency with which she handed everyone things. She did not say, Your Grace, every third sentence. She said, Your Grace, when she needed to distinguish him from someone else, and otherwise said, Sir, when she needed a title at all and said nothing when she did not. My father did not know what to do with this. I watched him not know. I watched him receive her in the usual way and find her not receiving back, and I watched him adjust, by some fraction I could see but not quantify, towards something that was not his usual receiving quality. He asked her about the book she had recommended. He asked her what she thought of the estate solicitor's letter, which was unusual. He did not as a rule ask anyone in the house for opinions on estate matters. He came into the morning room one afternoon and found her sitting in the chair nearest the window, reading, and instead of retreating to the study he sat in the other chair and read himself. And they spent an hour in the same room in the same comfortable, unself-conscious silence she had established at breakfast my first morning. And when he got up to go he said, Miss Wren, and she said, Sir, and he said, The roses. In the garden. They were my wife's, and she said, I know. Mrs. Henwick told me. They're extraordinary even now. And he said, Yes, and went. I watched this from the door. I was not proud of watching from the door. But I could not stop. I found Isolde in the library that evening. She was writing a letter to whom I did not ask, and when I came in she did not look up immediately, which I had stopped finding rude and started finding restful. "You watched us," she said when she looked up. "I'm sorry," I said. "No, you're not," she said without rancor. "You're trying to understand something. That's different from spying." I sat down across from her. "What is it you do?" I said. "With him, what are you doing?" She set down her pen. She considered the question with the actual consideration she brought to everything. "Nothing," she said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just present. I don't think he's had very many people simply present with him. They're all managing him or being managed by him, and he is very good at the latter, which means the former tends to produce the same result. I just don't manage him, or allow him to manage me." "He finds you very unusual," I said. "I imagine he does," she said. "Most people find me unusual." She said this without either pride or apology. "Your father is an interesting man, Mr. Callum. He is very lonely in a way that he has had so long he no longer knows its loneliness. He thinks it is dignity." I was quiet for a moment. "My father is the Duke of Caerwyn," I said, and heard, as I said it, how hollow this sounded as a counter-argument. "Yes," she said, "that's the problem, isn't it?" She picked up her pen again. "He keeps your mother's portrait turned toward the window on Sunday mornings," she said. "That is not a man without feeling. It is a man who has put all of his feeling into one Sunday morning gesture, very privately, because he does not know how to do anything else with it." I went to bed that night and lay on the ceiling again, and thought about what she had said for a long time. She was right. She was entirely, uncomplicatedly right, which was a quality she had about her that I was finding both admirable and, in the particular context of my father, destabilizing. Because if my father was not without feeling, if my father was simply a man who had put all his feeling into the wrong containers, then 14 years of my having been away was not my father's fault, and my fault in equal measure, which was the comfortable position I had occupied since I was 23. It was something messier than that. I spent the third week at Caerwyn Hall in a state of increasing confusion about where my hostility was supposed to go. I had arrived with a clear allocation of feelings. Miss Dorothea was to be managed, my father was to be endured, and Miss Wren, the unknown variable, was to be assessed and probably found wanting in some useful way. She was not found wanting. She was found, on examination, to be the most direct and least performative person I had encountered in years, which was not a quality I had expected to find in a penniless young woman of no position who had arrived in a cold house in October, and simply stayed. I asked her about her mother, one afternoon in the rose garden, where I had taken to joining her walks without quite deciding to. She said she was unwell for 2 years. I managed the house. There wasn't much money, there had been less and less over the years, and by the end there was almost none. I sold most of the books. She paused. I kept 3. The ones she had read to me when I was small. And after she died, I sat in the house for 2 weeks, and then I received Miss Dorothea's letter, which was the first letter I had received in some time that was not a bill, and I thought, well, someone needs something I can do. I'd better go. "That's why you came," I said, "not for a position or—" "I came because someone needed something I could give," she said simply. "The rest sorted itself out." I thought about this. "You had nothing to go back to," I said, and heard, as I said it, that this was not as gentle as I had intended. She was not offended. "No," she said, "nothing urgent." That is, I found, rather freeing. She looked at the roses, the vast, unpruned, magnificent tangle of them, white and dark red, still holding some late-season color even in October. When you have nothing left to lose, you stop managing yourself so carefully. You just say what you think. People find it strange. "I find it," I stopped. She looked at me. "Yes." I said, I find it the only kind of conversation I want to have." She looked at me for a moment with the steady, observing quality she brought to everything, and then she looked back at the roses and said, "Your father's room faces the garden. I looked it up. He can see these from his window." "He never comes out to them," I said. "No," she said. "He's afraid of them. I think they were hers. He's afraid of what it would feel like to actually stand in them." She paused. "He'll come eventually, when he's ready." She was right about this too. 3 days later, I looked out the library window in the early morning and saw my father standing at the edge of the rose garden in his coat, not moving, simply standing there, looking at the roses in the gray October light. He stood there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he went back inside. He did not know I had seen. He did not know, I suspect, that Isolde had seen either, though I think she had. Her room also faced the garden, and she had the habit of being awake early. Neither of us said anything about it. Miss Dorothea died in the 3rd week of November. She went quietly on a Tuesday morning, with Isolde beside her and my father in the chair by the window and Mrs. Henwick standing in the doorway. She had been saying her goodbyes for a week, in her practical way, and she said them without fuss and went without fuss, which was entirely consistent with how she had done everything. I held her hand for the last hour, which I had not expected to do, and which she had apparently expected from me, because she had asked Mrs. Henwick to fetch me, and Mrs. Henwick had. Afterward in the corridor, Isolde put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "She spoke of you often," and I said, "Did she?" And she said, "Yes, with great affection. She thought you were very like your father, and she meant it as a compliment, which I thought you should know." And then she went to manage what needed managing, because there was a great deal to manage, and she was the person who managed things. The practical aftermath of Miss Dorothea's death occupied a fortnight. There was a will, modest, everything correctly arranged, and a small service in the village, and Mrs. Henwick organized everything with her usual competence, and Isolde assisted, and I spent considerable time with the estate solicitor, reviewing what Miss Dorothea's departure meant for the East Wing and the household arrangements. My father was present for all of this in the way that he was always present, formally, correctly, managing the surface, and I watched him manage it and thought, "She is going to leave. Her purpose here is concluded, and when she leaves he will close again entirely, and it will be as though she was never here at all." I thought about this at considerable length. I thought about it in a way that was not entirely about my father. I found Isolde in the morning room on the 3rd day after the service, going through Miss Dorothea's books, sorting them for distribution according to the will. She was working systematically, which was how she did everything, and she looked up when I came in and said, "I'll be finished by Thursday." I thought I'd go Friday if that suits. I said, "Where will you go?" She said, "I have a friend in Edinburgh. She's offered a room for the winter while I find something." She said this without complaint. It was simply the next arrangement. I said, "My father has not asked you to stay." She looked at me steadily. "It would not be appropriate for him to ask me to stay without a specific position to offer," she said. "Miss Dorothea is gone. I was her companion, not his." She paused. "I think he would like to ask, but he doesn't know how, and I'm not going to make it easier for him by waiting indefinitely for him to work it out." I said, "He has not been asked anything in many years." "I know," she said. "That is partly his own doing and partly everyone else's, and it isn't something I can fix by staying. He has to choose to ask." She set a book down. "He is capable of choosing. He simply hasn't been given the occasion." I left her to the books. I went and found my father in the study and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, which I had not done in this room since I was 17. He looked at me. I said, "I want to talk to you about something." He said, "All right." There was a silence. I had a great deal prepared, and all of it was wrong, and I set it aside and said instead, which was, I think, the most Isolde Wren thing I had ever done in my life, I want to talk to you about what happened, not to assign fault, not to reopen it, but because I know, that we have both been very lonely for 14 years and neither of us has known what to do about it, and I think we ought to try. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, yes, and his voice had a quality I had not heard in it since I was a boy, something unmanaged, something that had not been put through the surface first. I think we ought to. We talked for 2 hours. I will not reproduce it. It was not graceful and it was not resolved. 14 years do not resolve in 2 hours, but it was real, which was something neither of us had been to each other in a very long time. By the end of it, we were both tired in the way that comes from having used muscles you have not used in years, which was right, which was exactly right. I went back to the morning room. Isolde was still sorting books. I said, my father would like to ask you something. I think he would like you to give him the occasion. She looked at me. That is a very particular form of interference, she said. I know, I said. I have had a very particular teacher. Something moved through her expression, the thing that was not quite a smile and considerably warmer than what had been there before. She set down the book she was holding. She went to find my father. I do not know exactly what was said. I know that she was with him for 45 minutes, which I established by standing in the corridor and pretending to look at the portraits, which was a thing I had done as a child and which apparently I had not outgrown. When she came out, she did not look at me directly, which was the only time I had ever known her not to look directly at the person she was speaking to. She said, he has asked me to stay for the winter, as a companion to the household. He was very formal about it. I said, and I said yes, she said, obviously. She walked past me and went back to the morning room and picked up the book she had set down, and I stood in the corridor for a moment and thought, obviously, as though it were the simplest thing, as though a cold, armored, 71-year-old duke asking a penniless young woman to stay in his house as his companion, not as a position, not as a function, but as herself, wanted, was the most self-evident outcome in the world. I went back to London 2 days later. I came back for Christmas, which I had not done in 14 years. I came back in March. I came back in July. Each time Caerwyn Hall was, by some incremental but irreversible degree, less cold. The rose garden by the following summer was being addressed, not tamed, but attended to, the worst of the overgrowth cleared, and my father stood at the edge of it one Saturday morning, and I watched him from the window and then went down and stood beside him, and we looked at the roses together without speaking, which is the vain way of saying a great deal. Isolde had her own room in the west wing and a great many of the Hall's books, and a habit of breakfast at 8, and an understanding with Mrs. Henwick that had by this point developed into something that could reasonably be called friendship, which Mrs. Henwick would not have called it but which everyone else could see. She wrote letters in the morning room. She walked in the rose garden. She handed my father things he needed before he knew he needed them, and she spoke to him plainly when she had something to say and was silent when she did not. And gradually, over months, over seasons, the surface that had been managing itself for so long began to be unnecessary. They were engaged the following spring. My father, who had been composing this question for some time, asked her in the rose garden, because that was where she had always been most entirely herself, and he knew it, which is how I knew before she told me that he had finally understood something about her. She said yes. The word had, I imagine, the same quality it always had when she said it, completely plain, entirely certain. I stood beside my father at the small ceremony in the Dunstrath church that summer and thought about what 14 years of silence had cost us, and what one winter had begun to return. He was the same formal, composed, difficult, deeply feeling man he had always been. She was the same plain-spoken, direct, completely present woman she had arrived as, no more romantic, no more performed, no more anything. But the way he looked at her when she said the words, that was not composed, that was not managed, That was a man looking at the person who had reached past 14 years of armor and said, without agenda and without strategy and without even intending to, I see you. I am not afraid of you. Isolde had not come to Caerwyn Hall to fall in love with my father. She had come because Miss Dorothea needed a companion, and Isolde had nothing left to lose, and it seemed useful. She stayed because my father asked her to, and she had found in the asking something worth staying for. It is not a romantic story in the usual sense. There are no ballrooms, no dramatic reversals, no society brought to its knees. It is the story of a woman with nothing who gave the most valuable thing she had, her complete, unhurried, entirely genuine presence, to a man who had not been truly seen in 14 years, and of what that presence cost her and gave her and made between them. I am the one who tells it because I am the one who watched it from the corridor, from the breakfast table, from the rose garden, from the window of my childhood room that my father had kept as I left it, with the water glass on the nightstand and the books on the shelf and the lamp that someone, he, had lit the evening I arrived, to say something he did not know how to say any other way. He knew how by the end. She taught him. Not intentionally, she was not a teacher, and she would object to the word. She was simply present, and in being present she made it possible for him to be the same, and that, in my experience, is the rarest and most necessary thing one person can give another. I came back to Caerwyn Hall that October, and I have not left. My room is still my room. My father is my father, in a way he has not been since I was young. And Isolde is well. She is at breakfast at 8 with a letter and a piece of toast, looking up with the direct, unhurried attention she has always had, and when she looks at me it is with the same complete absence of performance she has always brought to everything. Which is, I find, exactly what I needed all along.